I never thought the man I married would look me in the eyes and tell me he didn't love me anymore. Not after 22 years. Not after everything we had built together. Not after the 2 children we raised side by side in a small house on Maple Grove Street that we painted ourselves one hot summer weekend because we couldn't afford to hire anyone. But that is exactly what happened on a Tuesday evening in October. While I was stirring a pot of soup on the stove and our daughter was doing her homework at the kitchen table, and our son was upstairs on a video call with his college roommate, Daniel walked in, set his keys on the counter the way he always did, and instead of kissing my cheek like he had done for 2 decades, he said, in the calmest voice you can imagine, that he was leaving us. Not leaving the room. Not leaving for work. Leaving us. Leaving me, leaving our children, leaving the life we had spent our entire adult years constructing brick by brick. My name is Sarah, and if you are new here, welcome to Emotional Revenge Stories, the channel where we share real emotional journeys about betrayal, family, and the karma that always seems to find its way back to the people who think they can walk away from the ones who loved them the most. If stories like this move you, stay until the end. Because what happened to my husband after he left us is something I never could have predicted. And it is a story about how the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. I turned the stove off, wiped my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and asked him to repeat what he had just said. Because surely, after everything, after the mortgage we had paid together, after the nights we had stayed up with sick children, after the vacations we couldn't afford but took anyway just to give our kids memories, surely he wasn't standing in our kitchen telling me our marriage was over. But he repeated it, word for word, as if he had rehearsed it in the car on the way home. He said he had met someone else. Her name was Renee. She worked at the marketing firm 2 floors above his office downtown, and according to him, she made him feel alive in a way that I no longer did. He said this while our daughter sat 6 feet away from him, her pencil frozen above her math homework, her eyes wide with a kind of confusion that no 14-year-old should ever have to experience in her own home. I remember the way her hand trembled as she closed her notebook and quietly walked upstairs without saying a word. Because she already understood, in that instinctive way children understand pain before they understand the reasons behind it, that something in our family had just shattered beyond repair. I want you to understand something about the man I married. Daniel was not a bad person when I met him. He was warm, he was funny, he worked hard, and in the early years he made me feel like the luckiest woman alive. We met at a small diner where I used to work weekends to pay for community college, and he used to come in every Saturday morning, order the same black coffee and 2 eggs over easy, and leave a $5 tip on a $7 bill because he said I always made his day better. We built a life from nothing. He worked his way up from an entry-level position at a logistics company to a regional manager role, and I stayed home with the children when they were young, then went back to work part-time as a bookkeeper once our son started school. We weren't rich, but we were happy, or at least I believed we were. Looking back now, I realize happiness is not always a mutual thing. Sometimes only one person in the marriage is holding on to it, while the other has already quietly let go. The weeks after Daniel told us he was leaving were some of the darkest I have ever lived through. He didn't leave immediately. He stayed in the house for another 11 days, sleeping in the guest room, coming and going as if nothing had changed, while I tried to hold together whatever pieces of normal life I could for our children. Our son Ethan came home from college for the weekend when he heard the news, and I will never forget the look on his face when he sat across from his father at the dinner table and asked him directly if the rumors were true. Daniel didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He simply said that sometimes people grow apart, that sometimes life takes you in a different direction, that he hoped one day Ethan would understand. Ethan stood up from the table, pushed his chair in so hard it nearly tipped over, and said he would never understand how a father could destroy his family over a woman he had known for 4 months. Then he walked out the front door and didn't come back until almost midnight. I found out later, through a conversation with Daniel's own sister, that the affair had actually been going on for almost a year before he ever said a word to me. A full year of lies, of business trips that weren't business trips, of late nights at the office that were spent somewhere else entirely, of anniversary dinners where he sat across from me smiling while carrying a secret that would eventually blow our family apart. That betrayal cut deeper than the initial announcement ever did, because it meant that every memory from that year, every laugh we shared, every quiet evening on the porch, every moment I believed was real, had actually been happening while he was living a double life. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor that night after his sister told me, staring at the tile, feeling like the floor beneath my entire existence had been quietly hollowed out for months without me ever suspecting a thing. If you're finding yourself moved by this story already, I want to ask you for a small favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because on Emotional Revenge Stories, we tell real, raw stories about family betrayal, karma, and the justice that eventually finds the people who think they can hurt others without consequence. Trust me, the second half of this story is going to show you exactly what happens when the universe decides to settle the score, and you won't want to miss a single second of it. Daniel officially moved out on a Sunday afternoon in late October. He packed 2 suitcases and a few boxes, loaded them into his car, and drove away without so much as a proper goodbye to either of our children. Our daughter Lily stood at her bedroom window and watched his car disappear down the street, and when I went up to check on her, she asked me a question that broke something inside me permanently. She asked, in the smallest voice I had ever heard from her, whether it was her fault that her father left. I held her for almost an hour that night, promising her over and over that none of this was her fault, that sometimes adults make selfish choices that have nothing to do with their children, but I could see in her eyes that the doubt would linger for a long time, maybe forever. In the months that followed, I learned things about my marriage that I had never known, things that made the betrayal even more painful than I initially understood. Daniel had been quietly moving money for months, transferring funds from our joint savings account into a separate account I had no knowledge of, under the excuse of an investment opportunity he claimed would benefit our retirement. When I finally gained access to our full financial records during the divorce proceedings, I discovered that nearly $40,000 had been drained from what we had spent 15 years saving. Money meant for our children's college funds, money meant for our future, and a significant portion of it had been spent on gifts, trips, and a downtown apartment he had secretly rented for himself and Renee months before he ever told me the truth. He had been planning his exit long before he ever gave me the courtesy of an honest conversation. The divorce process itself was brutal. Daniel hired an aggressive lawyer who tried to argue that I was entitled to less than I deserved because I had been out of full-time work for several years while raising our children, as if raising 2 human beings and managing an entire household for over a decade was somehow worth nothing. I remember sitting in that lawyer's office, listening to grown adults argue over the value of the sacrifices I had made, feeling smaller and more invisible than I had ever felt in my entire life. But something in me refused to be erased. I hired the best lawyer I could afford, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who had handled dozens of cases exactly like mine. And she looked me directly in the eyes during our first meeting and told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that men like Daniel often underestimate the women they leave behind because they assume heartbreak will make us weak, when in reality, heartbreak often forges the kind of strength that changes everything. While the divorce dragged on for nearly 8 months, I had to find a way to keep our household functioning. I picked up additional bookkeeping clients, working late into the night after Lily went to bed, teaching myself new accounting software so I could offer more services and charge higher rates. It wasn't glamorous work, and there were nights I cried at my kitchen table out of sheer exhaustion, wondering how I was going to keep paying the mortgage on a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet without Daniel's presence, even a presence that had betrayed me. But slowly, month by month, I began to rebuild something. I started managing the books for a small local restaurant, then a landscaping company, then a boutique clothing store downtown, and word began to spread that I was reliable, detail-oriented, and honest, 3 qualities that apparently many bookkeepers in the area lacked. Meanwhile, Daniel's new life with Renee appeared, at least from the outside, to be everything he had left us for. They moved into a stylish apartment downtown, and from what mutual friends told me, they were often seen out at expensive restaurants, at weekend getaways, living the kind of carefree life he had claimed our marriage no longer offered him. For a while, I won't pretend I didn't feel a deep, aching jealousy, watching from the outside, as he seemed to move on so effortlessly while I was struggling to hold our family together with what felt like nothing but willpower and exhaustion. But my mother, who had been through her own painful divorce decades earlier, told me something I have never forgotten. She said that the beginning of someone else's new relationship is always the highlight reel, and highlight reels rarely show what happens once the excitement fades and reality sets back in. She was right. It didn't take long for cracks to begin appearing in Daniel's perfect new life. though at the time I had no idea just how deep those cracks would eventually run. The first sign came about a year after the divorce was finalized, when Ethan, who had reluctantly maintained some contact with his father, mentioned during a phone call that Daniel had lost his job. Apparently, the same aggressive, ambitious personality that had made him successful in his career had also led him to cut corners in ways that eventually caught up with him. There were whispers of falsified expense reports, inflated sales numbers, and questionable dealings with a supplier that violated company policy. Daniel had always been someone who believed rules were for other people, that his charm and his results would always shield him from real consequences. But companies, unlike wives, are far less forgiving when they discover they've been deceived. He was terminated without severance, and just like that, the steady six-figure income that had funded his glamorous new lifestyle with Renee disappeared almost overnight. I remember feeling an unexpected wave of emotions when I heard this news, a strange mixture of vindication and something almost like sadness. Because despite everything he had done, some small, stubborn part of me still remembered the man who used to leave $5 tips at a diner because he wanted to make a struggling waitress smile. But that part of me had learned, through painful experience, not to let sympathy cloud the reality of who Daniel had become. If this story is resonating with you, and you believe that karma has a way of finding people who hurt their families, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in my situation. Your support means everything to this channel, and it helps us continue sharing real, powerful stories about family, betrayal, and justice. Without his income, the downtown apartment quickly became unaffordable, and according to what I later learned from mutual acquaintances, Renee, who had always seemed drawn to Daniel's confidence and financial stability, began to grow distant once the money and status started slipping away. Relationships built on excitement and image rather than genuine partnership rarely survive hardship, and theirs was no exception. Within 4 months of losing his job, Daniel and Renee's relationship fell apart entirely. I heard through the grapevine that she had already moved on to someone else, a business owner with considerably more financial stability than an unemployed former regional manager could offer. The very qualities that had made Daniel appealing to her in the first place, his money, his confidence, his ability to spoil her with expensive dinners and weekend trips, evaporated the moment his circumstances changed, and so did she. Daniel moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, a stark contrast to the downtown high-rise he had once been so proud of. Ethan told me during one of our increasingly rare conversations about his father that Daniel had grown quieter, more withdrawn, spending most evenings alone. Meanwhile, my own life was beginning to blossom in ways I never could have anticipated during those darkest early days after he left. My bookkeeping business had grown to the point where I needed to hire an assistant, and within 2 years, I had built a small but respected accounting firm that served over 30 local businesses. I purchased a modest but comfortable townhouse for Lily and myself, closer to her school, in a neighborhood with a strong sense of community that reminded me of simpler, happier times. Lily, who had struggled so much emotionally in those first months after her father left, slowly began to heal. She excelled in her studies, developed a passion for art that she pursued with the same quiet determination I recognized in myself, and eventually earned a partial scholarship to a respected university's fine arts program. Watching her walk across that graduation stage years later, knowing everything she had overcome, remains one of the proudest moments of my entire life. Ethan, too, found his footing, graduating with a degree in mechanical engineering and landing a position at a respected firm 2 states away, a young man who, despite his father's failures, had grown into someone principled, hardworking, and kind. Someone who understood the value of loyalty precisely, because he had witnessed firsthand what its absence could do to a family. But the most unexpected turn in this story came almost 5 years after Daniel first walked into our kitchen and told me our marriage was over. I received a phone call one evening from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, I was surprised to hear Daniel's voice on the other end, quieter and more hesitant than I remembered it ever being. He asked if we could meet in person, that there were things he wanted to say to me, things he felt he owed me after everything that had happened. Every instinct in me wanted to refuse, to protect the peace I had worked so hard to build, but something, perhaps closure, perhaps simple curiosity, made me agree to meet him at a quiet coffee shop the following weekend. When I saw him walk through the door that day, I barely recognized the man sitting across from me. Gone was the confident, polished executive who had once believed the rules of loyalty didn't apply to him. In his place was someone who looked tired, humbled, and older than his years. He told me that after Renee left, after the job loss, after months of struggling to rebuild a career that had been tainted by his own dishonesty, he had finally been forced to confront the reality of what he had thrown away. He told me he had gone through months of therapy, something he had always dismissed in the past as unnecessary, and that for the first time in his life, he had truly examined the choices that led him to destroy the family that had loved him unconditionally for over 2 decades. He apologized, not with excuses, not with the same deflections he had once used to justify his affair, but with what felt like genuine, painful accountability. He acknowledged that he had taken for granted everything I had given him, that he had mistaken comfort and stability for boredom, and that by the time he realized the magnitude of his mistake, the life he had walked away from no longer existed to return to. He told me he had watched from a distance as Ethan and Lily grew into remarkable young adults largely without him, as I built a thriving business and a peaceful, happy home without him, and that the hardest truth he had ever faced was realizing that his family had not only survived his absence, but had flourished in ways that made him question everything he thought he understood about what mattered most in life. I sat across from him that day, listening to a man finally understand a truth I had been forced to learn the hardest way possible 5 years earlier, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet, steady sense of peace. I told him that I forgave him, not because what he did wasn't devastating, not because the scars he left on our family had fully healed, but because carrying that anger for the rest of my life would only continue to give him power over my happiness, and I had spent 5 long years reclaiming that happiness piece by piece. I told him that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it certainly didn't mean going back, but that I refused to let his mistakes define the rest of my story. Daniel eventually rebuilt a modest, quiet life for himself, working in a smaller role at a different company, living a far more humble existence than the one he had once believed he deserved. He reconnected slowly and carefully with Ethan and Lily, though the relationship remained forever changed by what he had done, a relationship built now on cautious respect rather than the unconditional trust that once existed before he broke it. As for me, I continued building the life I had created from the wreckage he left behind. My accounting firm grew into one of the most respected in the area. I eventually found love again, a kind, steady man named Robert who valued honesty and loyalty above all else, someone who treated Lily and Ethan with genuine warmth, someone who reminded me that the right kind of love doesn't require you to shrink yourself or question your worth. Looking back on everything that happened, I understand now that the betrayal I experienced that Tuesday evening in October was never truly the end of my story, even though at the time it felt like the end of everything I had ever known. It was, in the most painful way possible, the beginning of discovering exactly how strong I was capable of becoming. Daniel believed that leaving us would set him free, that a new relationship and a life without the responsibilities of a struggling marriage would bring him the happiness he claimed he was searching for. Instead, his choices led him down a path of loss, humiliation, and hard-earned humility, while the family he abandoned rose from the wreckage stronger, more resilient, and more united than we had ever been before. If there is one thing I hope you take away from my story, it is this. Karma does not always arrive quickly, and it does not always arrive in the dramatic ways we imagine when we are sitting in our darkest moments, wishing for justice. Sometimes karma arrives quietly, patiently in the form of lost relationships, lost careers, and the slow, painful realization that the life someone destroyed can never truly be rebuilt the same way for them, no matter how many years pass. And sometimes, the greatest form of justice is simply living a life so full, so peaceful, and so genuinely happy that the person who once tried to break you is forced to watch from a distance as you become everything they never believed you could be without them. Thank you so much for watching this story until the end. If it moved you, if it made you think about your own family, your own strength, or your own journey through betrayal and healing, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Emotional Revenge Stories for more real and powerful family drama content, and leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were in my position. Would you have forgiven him the way I did, or would you have walked away for good? And please share this story with someone in your life who might need to hear it today, someone who is struggling to see their own strength through their pain. Sometimes the story of a stranger is exactly what someone needs to find the courage to keep going. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this community. And I will see you in the next story.